This week's topic is Curious Collections, the establishment of the Redpath Museum, 1880 to 1900. The Redpath Museum is centrally located in the McGill University campus. From its interior and exterior, one can get the feeling that it is very much rooted in 19th century history. And that's exactly the case, as it is the oldest building dedicated as a museum in Canada. The museum's dedication in 1882 featured the attendance of prominent dignitaries like the Governor-General, the Marquess of Lorne. The opening ceremony revealed a broader ideological and structural processes at play that positioned the museum into a very specific context. For example, few visitors today would understand that it was dedicated, quote, to the study and varied and wonderful manifestations of God's creations by Chancellor Charles Lewis Day. By exploring the establishment of the museum, it exposes the transnational history, whose legacies continue to lurk inside its galleries today. It is impossible to understand the history of the Redpath Museum without John William Dawson. Dawson was a prominent Nova Scotian geologist who served as the principal of McGill University from 1855 to 1893. The design and creation of the museum largely followed his vision of the natural sciences and educational reform, and it was his personal connections that led to significant donations. The collection and display of objects for scientific study dates back to the 17th century in the model of the private cabinet of curiosities. Dawson, the son of Scottish immigrants in Nova Scotia, created his own cabinet of curiosities in his kitchen cupboards in his youth that became the basis of his collection for teaching. In 1840, he studied under geological experts at the University of Edinburgh, and Susan Bronson connects the museum's architectural features to examples Dawson saw in Edinburgh, such as Dr. Richard Owen's Hunterian Museum, which had a semicircular lecture theater, which is an example that is visible at the Redpath Museum. When Dawson arrived at McGill in 1855, the university had a collection of a single fossil. During his time as principal, he grew the collection considerably, and it was established during a time where a number of prestigious natural science museums in Britain and the United States were being founded, like the Peabody Museum of Natural History at Yale University. The creation of the museum was indebted to the significant donation of $140,000 by Peter Redpath. Redpath was a key shareholder in his father's Redpath Sugar Refinery, which refined raw sugar cane from the Caribbean and sold to a Canadian market. Peter Redpath also served on the Board of Governors at McGill from 1864 to 1866 and funded the creation of the nearby Redpath Library. The construction of the museum began in 1880 to celebrate Dawson's 25th anniversary as president. The Greek Revival building was designed by architects Hutchison and Steele, who also worked on the eastern block of the Parliament buildings in Ottawa and the Ice Palace in Montreal. After 2.5 years, the museum opened to the public and was also dedicated to house the collections of geology, mineralogy, paleontology, zoology, botany, and archaeology. This explanation of the history of the Redpath Museum is a very conventional narrative. However, Dawson had a number of goals for the museum which are often underexplored. Primarily, Dawson was a deeply convicted Presbyterian, and he envisioned the museum as a testament to God's design. In his address at the dedication, he refers to the ongoing evolutionary theories of Charles Darwin as a false philosophy. Dawson was a regular guest speaker at the Victoria Institute in London, which was established in direct response to Darwin's On the Origins of Species in 1865. During his lectures, he often referenced the collections at the Redpath Museum. For example, the 1896 lecture on the Guanches skulls from the Canary Islands. The skulls were collected by R.S. Halliburton from a cave during his visit to the Canary Islands in 1881. Dawson compared the characteristics of the skull to that of Mediterranean, Moroccan, and Haudenosaunee skulls to argue for the unity of God's design His worldview shaped the design of the museum as well as the education of his students and visitors. For example, the archaeological section in the 1885 guide demonstrates how objects from completely different contexts were displayed together to argue for the unity of God's creations. The archaeological collection included a collection from Haida Gwaii Islands, then called the Queen Charlotte Islands, collected by George Mercer Dawson, skulls demonstrating the principal races of men, and the objects collected by Reverend Robertson from Vanuatu, which was then called the New Hebrides in Oceania. The archaeological collection demonstrates how the Redpath Museum fits into a larger history of the colonial project. Much of the collections were part of processes of colonial expansion. The study of ecological resources and the indigenous populations led to the extraction of natural resources and the subjugation of indigenous peoples under the insertion of British sovereignty. This period was also an era of amateur archaeology and anthropology, which was largely practiced in conjunction to scientific expeditions and missionary projects that had no standardized ethical practices. The case of George Mercer Dawson and his 1878 trip to Haida Gwaii demonstrates these tensions. George Mercer Dawson was Dawson's son who joined the Geological Survey of Canada. He surveyed much of northwestern Canada, and he is the namesake of Dawson City. His primary focus on his trip to Haida Gwaii was to map the geological formations, but he also amassed a collection of Haida artifacts and published a report on the Haida communities. The report is an extensive study on the Haida language and customs, and his 1878 diary presents the large role Haida men played in his study, as he was relying on their knowledge of the landscape. There is evidence in his diary of agency from the Haida guides who asked for higher wages, as well as sellers who refused to bargain with him for the prices of the items he collected. Despite this, Dawson took complete ownership of these reports and presents Haida communities as historical subjects. This worldview encompasses a practice of salvage ethnography, which is the recording of indigenous communities as settlers viewed their way of life as fundamentally incompatible with the forces of settler colonialism. The practice of salvage ethnography led to what was referred to as the Scramble for Northwest Artifacts by scholar Douglas Cole. Museums from around the world wanted collections of indigenous artifacts, and one example is the work of Charles F. Newcomb, who acquired totem poles from Haida Gwaii for museums around the world. In the present day, the legacies of these tensions are still evident, as the Dawson collection from Haida Gwaii is a foundational collection in the McCord Museum. For many of the objects in the archaeological collections at the Redpath Museum, there was a lack of transparency about how the objects were collected. It was clear that some were gifts, some were purchased, and some, like in the case of missionary Reverend Robertson in Vanuatu, they were confiscated items that were used in spiritual practices. An 1898 letter in the McGill Archives by Ellen Weber detailed the story behind the pipe she would like to donate to the museum. She paid a Shinnecoin man to open the grave of his great-grandfather to obtain the pipe that was buried with him. And this is just one of the examples of the great lengths people went to amass large collections. Another way the archaeological collection was formed through the processes of colonialism was the Egyptian artifacts. In the present-day museum, there are 3 human mummies located on the 3rd floor in the World Cultures exhibit. However, the context surrounding these mummies are not described anywhere in the museum. The exact origins of the mummies are not clear, but 2 of them were obtained by McGill Chancellor James Ferrier in 1859. Ferrier was a committed Presbyterian, and he traveled to Egypt as part of a tour of the Holy Land. The mummies were likely acquired through a well-known smuggler named Mustafa Aga Ayad. The mummies were donated to the Natural History Society and later deposited at the Redpath Museum in 1925. The 3rd mummy was the Fayum mummy, donated by Sir Thomas Roddick from his participation in the Anglo-Egyptian War in 1882. All of these examples demonstrate the lasting legacies of colonialism, evolutionary debates, and salvage ethnography at the Redpath Museum. Today, the Redpath Museum holds over 17,000 ethnographic objects, and any transparency about how they were donated is nearly impossible to find. The museum has been closed to visitors since March of 2020, and it's clear that these issues will have to be faced directly if the museum is to reopen its historic doors.